tonight we think about abolishing the capitalist family. Then next week, on Tuesday, we will think about abolishing the capitalist job market. And the person who does the thinking is Marguerite van den Berg, a researcher. And all of our next events will happen not here at Vooruit. This is our last event at the Vooruit. They will happen at the Miri Concertzaal. Then, on the 12th of March, we have Olga Biszka. She's a historian, a writer, and a queer activist from Poland who will talk about the way democracies come to an end, using Poland as a case study during the last 30 years, which coincides with Olga's own lifespan. Then, on the 16th of April, we welcome Maud van Wallegem, ex-politician and human rights activist, and she will have a beautiful talk about the consequences of losing a young child, your own child, and what this does to you emotionally, but also administratively and politically, and how we can make better policy around death. Last but not least, on the 30th of April, we have Naima Charkaoui, who will talk to us about abolishing our current murderous border system. So by the end of our talks, I think we have abolished about everything that needs to be abolished. Now, for tonight, we welcome Sophie Lewis. She will give a talk about an hour to an hour and 10 minutes, we think. And who is Sophie, dare you ask? Well, she is a feminist writer and independent researcher, well known for her books Feminism Against Family and Full Surrogacy Now. And I've heard she's working on a new book, which will come out in January 2025, with the enticing title, Enemy Feminisms. After this hour and 10 minutes of a talk, Sophie will have a conversation with Siggy Vertomme. And Siggy is an assistant professor of gender studies at the University of Amsterdam. And she's also a postdoc researcher at the University of Ghent. How does she do it? And her research focuses on the global politics of medically assisted reproduction. Then there's one more person I need to introduce to you, and that is Katrien, our wonderful sign language interpreter. I would also like to remind you that the event tonight will be recorded. The cameras are pointed towards us, towards the stage, not towards you. But take that in mind. There might be time for some questions. Those questions will be recorded as well. And we will also ask you to really ask the questions in the microphone. So wait until you have the microphone, or your question will not be recorded. For now, there's nothing left for me to do but to ask you for a warm round of applause to welcome to the stage Sophie Lewis.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really happy to be asked by Anais and thankful to all the people you would expect me to be. I'm very excited to be in conversation with Siggy, one of my favorite feminist researchers. I will take just one more minute to reintroduce myself because I'm a strange hybrid para-academic kind of species. So as you already heard, I live in the United States. Despite my misleading British accent, I didn't even grow up in the UK. If I'm a writer, I write things like this. You can pose questions in French if you wish. I used to be on an academic track. I did masters in different subjects, as well as a PhD. But then I leaned out of the university to the point where I fell out for now. I live by writing cultural criticism, and I teach online. These are the sorts of courses you can sign up to from any time zone if you wish. Anais kindly mentioned one of the books that enabled this life to be possible, the Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family book. And I'm going to start there today because I think it helps contextualize the topic of today's lecture. In a way, I put the cart before the horse a little bit, writing a book about pregnancy which I frame as gestational labor, which is sort of looking at the labor we do with our uteruses, presupposing, as I wrote this book, a kind of family abolitionist political horizon. People wanted to know what that was. Not everyone had heard of family abolition, to my surprise. And while writing about the strange new possibilities afforded by what is commonly known as surrogacy, commercial gestational surrogacy, which is not an industry I defend, but thinking about the strange new possibilities this industry opens up for thinking about kinship and what unpaid gestating could do in solidarity with paid gestating, if that makes sense. I was drawing on a tradition of 200 years of people calling for abolition of the private household, the capitalist family. So that seemed like a necessary context for this, to bring you to the manifesto that I've been invited to present to you today in the context of a series on the theme of the end. It's a little red book. It carries this provocative title, Abolish the Family. And I want to introduce you to the sort of potted history. I won't go too heavy on the theory about the racialization of the family, which occupies chapter 2. I'll keep it to this archive of revolutionary reproductive politics in the West. And I'm hoping to sort of whet your appetites, make you excited and maybe indignant that you hadn't heard of this before. In the context of the question, what is abolishing something? Is it the same as ending it? Bearing in mind what Anaïs already kind of gestured towards. There are lots of different abolitions on the menu in Studium Generale. I have a very specific kind of take on what abolition is, and we'll talk about that at the end of the lecture. I think we should talk about why a shocking conversation like this would happen anyway. That's how I'm going to lead into the history. Why would anti-capitalist radicals have a problem with the family? And what do I mean? What did they mean by the family anyway? Of course, family forms vary from culture to culture quite radically. Yet, transculturally, family is a moral creed, an unselfish principle that one signs up to voluntarily without thinking about it, because it's every civic-minded individual's raison d'être. What alternative could there even be, right? The economic assumption that behind every breadwinner there is a private someone in charge of making sandwiches with that bread, someone worth being exploited for, vacuuming up the crumbs or hiring someone else to do so, refrigerating the leftovers or hiring someone else to do so, such that more bread can be won the next day. This feels to many of us like a description of human nature. Family is also the reason why a modern human being is supposed to want to go to work, the reason why they have to go to work, and more often than not, the reason why they can go to work. So in a real sense, the capitalist family is really hard to even think beyond. Without the family, who or what would take responsibility for the lives of non-workers, including the sick, the young, and the elderly? This is a sort of imaginative impasse that Marxist feminists have always pointed to when they call the family simply the privatization of care, or put differently, the form property, of whiteness, and of cisness, in the sense of, cis-sexual gender, falls to the family in no small part. But still, from the perspective of political economy, the foremost unique feature of the family, which also cuts across cultures in a capitalist mode of production, is its insistence that most of the responsibility for things like health, shelter, food, clothing, socialization, and leisure falls to individuals, individual kin. So the shortest formula for the problem I can think of is this: too much is being asked of too few. And the problem gives us vertigo, right? Because remember, it's not just the worker, this kind of abstract thing that the family is being tasked with giving birth to every day, in theory. It's also life. Yes, the family, is also the metaphysical and legal assertion that a baby, like a neonatal human animal, is the creation of a coupled dyad. And this act of authorship, in turn, generates for the author or authors some kind of quasi-property rights in their progeny. That's how capitalism has organized parenthood. And that entitlement also comes with quasi-exclusive accountability for the child's life. And it's rare that this total dependence, near total dependence of the young person on that quasi-property owner is portrayed as a harsh lottery. It's usually portrayed as natural, not in need of mitigation. And certainly when it comes to the bourgeoisie, rather beautiful for everyone concerned. Kids, it is proposed, benefit always from proximity to their manufacturers. Parents, it is supposed, derive nothing so much as joy from the romance of this isolated, overburdened intensity. Notwithstanding the constant allusions in art and pop culture to the hell that parents and children and other relatives inhabit, all too seldom is parenthood, for example, identified as the absurdly unfair distribution of labor it obviously is, or the despotic distribution of responsibility for and power over younger people that it obviously is. It's a distribution, we think, that can't be changed. It's strange, is it not, how superficially critical, yet fundamentally sort of respectful of the family Western popular culture is in general. Think of the horror of families in recent TV shows like Succession or The Crown, from War and Peace to Feston to The Simpsons. Our culture is obsessed with depicting the disappointments, the traumas, the shortcomings, even the violence of the nuclear household. And clearly this ubiquitous theme is serving some kind of role as a safety valve, preventing our imaginations from maybe grasping the possibility that this could be changed, that there's no necessity making life be fundamentally produced and reproduced in this way. So I think the frustration about family across culture and art is maybe a way of venting frustration about the family only to naturalize it. The family as we know it is not eternal. Something called famulus did exist, obviously, in antiquity, meaning in Latin, a collection of slaves. But the fact that's etymologically what that is, famulus. But the family as we know it, the central site of privatized care, is both a product of and a tool of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. via the enclosure of the commons, and specifically the part of that process that feminists like Silvia Federici and Maria Mies call housewifization. So the invention of the housewife took place in the context of witch hunts, of peasant wars, and, as I mentioned, of enclosures. It made possible the transformation of the domestic sphere into a miniature sort of contractor supplier for the state. Each private household became tasked with reproducing the human beings, workers, that the new proto-industrial cities demanded. As the Australian historian Melinda Cooper shows in her book Family Values, it's also crucial to understand the family as it developed after housewifization as an instrument for servicing debt, beginning with the so-called poor laws, which rendered kin, rather than the commonweal, privately accountable, for the first time in history, for the care of the vagrant, the elderly, the non-neurotypical or disabled, and their debts. The legislation in question helped enclose the ensemble of natural and relational commons on which many people depended and where communities were collectively sustained. So the family, which the laws instituted as a kind of unwaged offshoot of the state, displaced and replaced the commons as a social contract for care. And ever since then, I think you could say that the family has grown to be a microcosm of nationalism, incubating chauvinism and competition on a little scale. It poses as an organic element of historical progress, but as one historian writes in her book Imperial Leather, the family was indispensable for imperialism as an image of hierarchy within unity that grew indispensable for legitimating exclusion and hierarchy in general. So, like a factory with a billion branches, the family sort of pumps out individuals with a cultural and ethnic and a binary gender identity, with a racial consciousness. The family is like an infinitely renewable energy source, doing untold hours of free labor for the state and the market. The family makes the world go round. But I don't think that's straightforwardly a compliment. 50 years ago, the Western women's liberation movement blew the lid off the epidemic of patriarchal violence that goes down in the very place that we're taught to view as a sanctuary, away from quote-unquote stranger danger. 50 years ago, that's a long time. Has this knowledge faded, would you say, in contemporary feminism? The knowledge that the family is where the vast majority of the rape and the sexual abuse happens in the world? And if you're a woman victim, the vast majority of the murder as well? Nothing has changed in that regard. No one is more likely to rob, bully, blackmail, batter, or cage you, or inflict unwanted touch than family. So announcing an intention to treat you like family when you get on an American Airlines flight or you go into your local bank, it ought to make us a little bit uncomfortable. It doesn't make most of us uncomfortable, though, because the word family is a whirlpool of sentimentality that drowns reason. We believe that family means safety, well-being, belonging, and plenitude, against all the statistical evidence to the contrary. And that's because, secular or not, we have faith in family. By agreeing to take on this kind of state-mandated creed of family first, we are typically grasping at the only opportunity we can see of guaranteed trust, guaranteed recognition, and guaranteed togetherness. The marriage-based household is supposed to command respect, isn't it? From policemen, from other officers of the state. I mean, it doesn't if you're non-white or proletarian, but it is supposed to. All right, maybe you're thinking at this point, fine. But surely it would still be better to call for an expanded family or a reformed version of the family. It seems pretty reckless, doesn't it? To seek to defend a politics that could be construed as saying that families, the very thing that often works tirelessly to protect migrant, Black and Indigenous youth from violence or hide them from cops, free them from jails and so on, that those families are somehow equivalent to the other things that we want to abolish, like cops and courts and jails. But actually, I think it is the attempt to save various kinds of minoritized populations' forms of private householding from the analysis that is reckless. Because for the purposes of a politics of care communization, the family has to mean the capitalist family, in the sense that the privatization of care is something that no households can really escape entirely under this current mode of production. I cannot pass by this point in the argument without saying something about Rafa. I've been able to think of nothing else all day, and I'm sure the same is the case for many of you in the room, albeit I can't see you at all. As a feminist and a partisan of reproductive justice, and as a person associated with children's rights and with childbirth, I cannot go by any kind of public intervention in the midst of the mass deaths and the miscarriages and the maimings and the famine that my taxes are paying for without acknowledging Palestinian courage, insisting on anti-Zionism, and articulating a cry for a free Palestine from the river to the sea. On my travels these past weeks, I've learned that there are some feminists who will say that I shouldn't mix family abolition and Palestine, feminists who say in good faith that family abolition has nothing to do with the international fight against imperial and capitalist oppression, especially when the bombs are falling. I think that's the concern, and I imagine the question is something like this. Sophie, haven't you noticed that South Africa at the Hague itemized thousands of expressions of intent to target specifically the Palestinian family, the living archive of Palestinian ancestry, material narratives of Palestinian blood and breast milk lineages? Haven't I noticed that the Palestinian family is one of the main sites of resistance to settler colonial violence right now? But I'm not afraid of this kind of challenge. I've been thinking about Palestine before October 7th as a family abolitionist, thinking family abolition. It is central to the politics of any family abolitionist worth her salt, that the family, as a story, is enshrined in the definition of the grievable and in the legibility of any quote-unquote people's claim to national sovereignty. Family is materially, in myriad instances, the only thing that human beings have got. And that actually is the problem that family abolitionism names. It is the limits of the family that are touched every day when someone on TikTok uploads a video in Gaza distributing candy to a group of boys saying, "My sons, you are all my sons." And I think we can call this disaster polymaternalism. Disaster polymaternalism, a form of polymaternal care born of disaster. And it seems odd and somewhat besides the point to me to say in response to these kinds of practices that we can see every day on our phones that the nuclear family would be better than this. I feel similarly when pundits in the US talk about the quote-unquote two-parent privilege, as though two parents is better than one. Yeah, sure, a rather obvious point, but that somehow means that 20 parents are not better than two. The point I'm making is that the fact that the bombs are falling is not a reason to remove a revolutionary feminist lens. The family is not to be vindicated simply because colonized families are fighting for survival. We should really try not to romanticize things simply because our enemies are trying to destroy them. We should not become revanchists simply because it is imperial violence that is precipitating the development of alternatives. So to recap my digression, which as you can see is not really a digression at all, the insinuation that family abolition is somehow a privileged or a white politics in a moment of imperial war not only dismisses the whole politics' fugitive history, it also seems like an inattentive response to the survival skills emerging from the situation at hand. Last week, when I was in Vienna, a Palestinian woman told me that even before the era of the WCNSF, Wounded Child No Surviving Family, all children belong to all of us, was a common Palestinian saying. It makes perfect sense, she said, if one is willing to grapple with the possibility that the family is ultimately a scarcity-based way of organizing care. All children are the children of all of us makes sense as a distillation of a form of family abolitionism arising, yes, as a survival strategy, perhaps only intended to be temporary in an emergency, and as an adaptive measure to conditions of unthinkable violence. But it is nevertheless a standpoint that gives rise to transformation, and it is a radical, albeit tragically necessitated, deprivatization of care. And the hope of family abolition is radically decolonial and anti-genocidal, finally, because its fundamental hope is that as revolutionary action, both reactive and proactive, begin to remove the burdens on the private household, the logic of us and them starts to collapse altogether. And the logic of us for us and them for them becomes gradually everyone for everyone. And that's a quote, quoting the demand that the relatives of the Israeli hostages brought to the Knesset on October 28th. I'm not saying it was in and of itself revolutionary, but the family members were asking, as you probably know, that the thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, who had been there for, in some cases, decades, be released in exchange for the 240 at that time still living, kidnapped by Hamas. They were mobilizing, in my opinion, the moral authority of the family against the familism of the nation state. And if we follow the logic of this movement of real families against the family, by necessity, this policy proposal of everyone for everyone requires a repossession and a sharing of everything, i.e., everything for everyone. And that is quite simply what my politics reduces to, and what the still living dream of communization or communism with a small c means. Organized care scarcity is diabolical. It makes us cling the more tightly to that which we have, forgetting to demand that which we deserve. For conservatives and for nostalgics in particular, the end of the family is an anxious fantasy imagined as already upon us and played upon to great effect by neoliberals. And the fantasy itself is astonishingly durable. We can find this kind of narrative about kids these days where supposedly they aren't forming families as they ought to, all the way back in antiquity. Nowadays, the updated, populist version pits neoliberal atomization against the family and paints the family as an antidote to individualism, even a bastion of resistance to the marketization of the world. I'm sorry, actually, familism is individualism. By compelling us to get our needs met via private channels, i.e. receiving care from kin, or buying goods like food and services like private home cleaning, the family functions as an anti-social machine. The principles of family first automatically demands a prioritization of the self, the little team of self-support, of carers, of heirs, and property-like dependence over the wider collectivity. I think it goes a bit like this. You there, you're letting your family down, especially if you don't have one yet. The weak link in your domestic partnership is you, probably. Or maybe you aren't coupled yet, and surely you ought to be. Maybe you have commitment issues, or you don't have enough to offer. Either way, you surely aren't making your parents proud. Not really. Also, you don't look after grandpa as you should, do you? In any case, you definitely aren't a good enough son, good enough daughter, good enough grandchild. If you have children, you definitely aren't a good enough parent to them. Can you really guarantee their safety? Didn't you potentially traumatize or accidentally poison them that one time? Perhaps you ought to be a parent by now, and you aren't. Or possibly you don't want your own children, which makes you a kind of murderer of your family line, not to mention your mom's heart. Otherwise, clearly there's something wrong with you if motherhood isn't fulfilling you, if marriage is a disappointment, if you're estranged from your relatives or dissatisfied with a life devoted to your kids, if you can't stand your in-laws. Alternatively, you're too devoted, you're too family-oriented, in which case, what kind of career model are you setting in this cutthroat market society? You should feel guilty. Don't you feel guilty? If you don't feel guilty, you should feel guilty about that. If you live in an overdeveloped country, you've heard all of that, I think, 1,000 times, explicitly or not. You can call this familism, call it family values ideology, whose exponents are always decrying a breakdown of the family, even though no such breakdown has ever really occurred, notwithstanding the decline in marriage rates and the demise, yes, of the Fordist male breadwinner household. In 2024, more people depend on family than ever before in living memory. For many, there's only one thing worse than having a family under late capitalism, namely not having one. You can also call it, as I said, human nature, because the romantic couple form, imagined as biologically innate, remains the gold standard for full global citizenship, not to mention a normative standard enshrined in welfare programs and tax policies that emphasize uniting with a romantic partner as the way to marshal the resources to get by. You can call it, finally, the reigning economic regime, because that was uncanny. Wow, it's never happened to me before. You can call it the reigning economic regime, because scarcity is the motor of the whole system of privatized care, by which I mean, again, the family. Wow, Google Voice decides to respond to me now for the first time ever. Let me be clear. The family feels non-negotiable for many people right now because, in a way, it is non-negotiable. It is indispensable, especially for many marginalized and criminalized people's survival. But idealizing it is madness. The family is barely working. In the process of fulfilling its economic functions, it is killing and harming so many queer youths, so many women, so many kids, and other people too. Again, it's no less than the primary source of violence for all of the groups I mentioned. This is a permanent crisis, compounded by the material inability of so many battered and feminized people to flee. In pure economic terms, then, the family is crazily labor-intensive. It's resource inefficient in that it normalizes the fragmentation and the endless repetition across separated households, one after the other, of tasks and acts of consumption that would far, far better be undertaken in larger groups. So as such, for the new wave of family abolitionist thinkers like Kathy Weeks, Madeleine Lane McKinley, Jules Gleason, Lola Olufemi, Tiffany Letabo King, M.E. O'Brien, Iman Abdelhadi, and me, the capitalist family is firstly to be understood, as I've already insisted, via the lens of its privatization of human responsibility for the making of life, the making of people. The revival of family abolitionism from 2015 onwards in the Western Anglosphere began with an essay called Kinderkommunismus by Daniel K. Doyle Griffiths and Jules Gleason. It's unfolding now in multiple languages and in translation across Europe, East Asia, and the Americas. I'd venture to speak for all of us when I say it's not just a question of making visible the catastrophic situation of the familial status quo. It's also a question of thinking, what does the family prevent us from doing or desiring? What does the family prevent us from bringing to an end? I want to propose that denaturalizing the family is an important task for artists, amongst other people, today, and that speculative visions, in particular, can help educate our desire, to use a phrase of Frederick Jameson's, our desire to experiment with alternatives. In the British feminist activist Lola Olufemi's speculative intervention, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, we are invited to think resistance strategies from the home we will eventually destroy, from the family that is an albatross around our necks, and from the prison of identification. We are invited into an abolitionism that of course includes the family. How could it not include the family? Asks Lola. She writes that the nuclear family turns children into property, and that the stranglehold of biology and obligation has made a mess of our desires for too long. It has scuppered our plans, given us children we did not want in a world that could not help us. But, she cautions, adopting some kind of anti-child, anti-mother, or matrophobic stance in the manner of some queer negationism is almost as bad. It's a terrible answer. Quote, the imperative isn't to have a child or even to desire one. The imperative, no matter who you are, is to vow to protect them from all kinds of violence and terror and pain. That is the meaning of collective being. In a similar transgender Marxist spirit, the speculative fiction Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune by M.E. O'Brien and Iman Abdelhadi, suggests that the family is a significant part of the apparatus that stands in the way of overthrowing capitalism. As I say, it's an oral history of the future, specifically the period 2052 to 2072. One of the people from the future in this oral history is a New Yorker called Latif Timbers, and he's interviewed in the year 2069. Latif recounts how the upheaval of this revolution that happens in New York City initially separated him from his family of origin and tipped him into a situation where initially many children were surviving together in the ruins of a city in a big group. But then at the time of the interview, Latif has grown up and has chosen to reform the autonomous group from before the revolution, having spent a long time in a childcare creche founded by adult militants, a creche called Afro-Car. Latif works now as a gestation care coordinator. Which means that Latif is a point person for the whole care team that supports anybody at all, male or female, who is doing the labor of pregnancy. And Latif explains, just about anyone can do pregnancy now. About half of the people who do pregnancy choose to do so at home in their communes, but the other half choose to go to the gestation center, where there is a very high-tech situation of skillful, immersive care. There's a theater, there are counselors, there's a swimming pool, and so on. Emmy O'Brien, besides being an oral ethnographer in real life, she's one of the people behind the Trans Oral History Project in New York in real life, is also, besides being a fiction writer, obviously, a science fiction writer in a sense. She's also a professor of sociology and a psychoanalyst and a mother. She has published many texts on the subject of care, communization, including family abolition, a whole book, much longer than my little red pamphlet, on the history of the capitalist family. It's a great companion if your appetite has been whetted by Abolish the Family, because our projects have evolved together and are the product of the same struggles and thoughts. We're comrades. She spends a lot of time imagining, compared to me, who I haven't ventured into speculative fiction yet, otherwise worlds. She thinks deeply not only about the way things can and will be better, and the ways in which human beings will slowly transform as a result of the gradual elimination of artificial scarcity, she also thinks about the trauma that gets inflicted on people in the process of fighting and trying to overthrow capitalism. She thinks about the therapeutic needs that people who make a revolution bear. Anyway, M.E. is based in New York and Iman in Chicago. The two writers appear in this novel as older versions of themselves. They're relatively elderly women at this point, conducting interviews towards the 20th anniversary of the revolution of the New York Commune. And again, there are testimonies from ecologists, hackers, organizers, educators, carers, and teenagers. Latif is just one of them. There are people who have participated in the Intifada that finally liberates Palestine. And they're remarkable for their insistence on how long it takes for pain to fade. They also do a great job of bringing characters to life who want to turn the tables on their interviewers and learn about everyday life in the year 2022. And they're especially interested in the family. Here is Latif summarizing the old situation. Reading more and more about how people lived before, so he means the early 21st century, where we are. I've been realizing that family was usually blood, and that's who you lived with. And who you lived with was really tied into what you got. So like if your blood had food, you had food, and if they had a nice house and heat, you did too. If they didn't, well, tough shit for you. You were fucked. Honestly, it's hard to imagine making all your choices based on blood. Why would it matter so fucking much who gave birth to you? Or who you fell in love with, or who happened to have the same parent. Like, what if those people were straight up assholes? Or just didn't know how to take care of you? And people really only had two parents who were expected to take care of everything? So inefficient. Why wouldn't you collectivize things like childcare? It makes no goddamn sense. I still cannot believe that people used to do nursery-level care all by themselves with just one other person back in the day. Honestly, how? And in response to this, Iman, who is the interviewer, laughs. She says, "Why do you think birth rates dropped so much in the beginning of the 21st century? It was just so hard to do this in these tiny households of one or two people." It is too hard, isn't it? We all know it's too hard. There is actually no need for it to be this way. Instead of limiting our ambition to simply mitigating and supporting the basic blueprint of family economy, what if we started afresh from the old 1960s and 1970s women's liberationist insight that mothers deserve more than the family, that children deserve more than the family, that all people deserve more than the family. It is not necessary or inevitable that the care system that we all consent to turns so many of us individually into the reason why our parents suffered workplace exploitation for decades. This unpayable debt, as we all know, makes everyone involved resentful at least some of the time. Witnessing our caregivers' sacrifices, we feel guilty for wondering whether we nevertheless maybe deserved more than we got care-wise. We feel guilt that we don't want to put our family members over all other human beings, and guilt about the patently antisocial fact that we do. This type of cascading guilt about guilt, hampers our very ability to dream of other ways of relating, other ways of living, other ways of organizing shelter, food production, leisure, laundry, education. It binds us to scarcity, to the given. To be generous, this also stems from compassion a lot of the time. We think, oh, others close to us seem unfulfilled. Maybe that's my fault. Guilt can be an empathetic response vis-a-vis loved ones and their thwarted desires for a better life. But even here, our love for people in our family paradoxically becomes a cause of our inability to see the family as a source of harm to them. Instead, I think we can practice being good death doulas for the good death of the family by acknowledging the family together with our family members as the impossible demand that it is. What can we practice doing in the present? What can we start knowing out loud? And what, for instance, in the domain of DNA, can we refuse to know? How can we consciousness raise? In Everything for Everyone, Latif, the gestation care coordinator, is in the middle of telling Iman about a person who came into the gestation center recently. When Iman asks the question, how did she get pregnant? And Latif exclaims, whoa, we never ask that. That's not really our business. I think there was a lot of work around this politically in the last couple of decades. DNA doesn't give anyone ownership of children. Children are children. They're precious and beautiful, and it doesn't really matter who made them or how, you know? Once someone is pregnant, which is where I come in, we don't ask about the methods. Iman apologizes. Oh, that's okay, says Latif. There are still folks who ask. And that's something we've been working on in the repro world. We talk about it at conferences and at citywide meetings a lot, how to shift people's focus away from the bio of it all. But honestly, the very structure of the commune has already done away with people's attachment to the bio. Latif is explaining how following 2 decades of mass anti-capitalist insurrection, love itself in the year 2069 is no longer held hostage by money or food or shelter or education. I would add that the love that the Bolshevik commissar 100 years ago, Alexandra Kollontai, proposed as an antidote to what she called property love, capitalist love, was known as red love. This was really similarly a love not held hostage by concepts of blood and gene. Those of us who have advocated for family abolition for 200 years have not linked up with each other across the generations as well as we could. But we have at times attempted to create movement memory, and that's kind of part of what I'm doing, holding the flame aloft for a concept in a period of demobilization and political darkness. We have more or less, I'm sort of saying we, to include this long genealogy of comrades who didn't agree on everything. We've more or less always argued that how might we bring an end to care scarcity is not a question that can be answered separately from the question of how to end capitalism. You can't abolish the family without abolishing capitalism. Or if you can, whatever that is not our family abolition, it's something else, maybe destruction or prohibition. Utopian thinkers like Charles Fourier, historical materialists like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Bolsheviks like Kollontai, who I just mentioned, and in the US, my primary sphere of reference, 1968 era radicals from gay liberation to anti-psychiatry to crip power, disability liberation, to the radical wing of the welfare rights movement, to wages for housework. All of these family abolitionists were adamant that the communization of care is inextricably linked to the communization of all infrastructure. That's not necessarily to say that you shouldn't try any kind of family abolitionist praxis at home. Solidarity does begin at home, as the children's liberationists say, but make sure you try it most of all in the streets. There are many people out there hungry for praxis, people to link up with. I detect in the air a faint yet unmistakable desire to talk about family abolition again, and to tell the story of feminism, the story of gender liberation over the centuries as an insurgency against the private household. I will not deny that COVID was an insufficiently exploited opportunity for the left. It breaks my heart a little bit. Why didn't we ask for more? During a different state of national and international emergency, during World War II, English government experts stated publicly that the production of individual meals by individual housewives was wasteful both in economic and nutritional terms. This was called wartime socialism, right? So people briefly got to eat at British restaurants with piano music and flowers on the table. Obviously, the logic behind decommodified communal dining like this still holds in peacetime, as anyone involved in Food Not Bombs initiatives could tell you. Free meals enjoyed at long dining tables, adorned with bouquets. We could call this communal luxury. Sure. But why don't we insist while we're at it that communal luxury is a basic human need? Decommodified food, decommodified housing, decommodified public transport, decommodified and free 24/7 childcare and all ages education. These are basic human rights, are they not? Everyone for everyone, everything for everyone. Note that COVID lockdowns have helped illustrate to a lot of people very tangibly just how untenable families are. There is, I think, curiosity about what techniques can help organize reproduction and production for need rather than for profit. Why don't we amp up the pressure and spread the word? The family blackmails us into working shitty jobs for love of our kids until we're dead. It doesn't need to be like this. Wasn't it precisely the economic ideology of the family that drove so many of us, perversely, to threaten our loved ones' lives by going out to work for their sakes during lockdown? You know what? Love for one's family is actually a great starting point for recruitment into family abolition. I think it will be in part by thinking about the people currently in our families, i.e., what do they really need? How might those needs really be met, that we will figure out together how to bring about this happy ending for the capitalist family. Family abolition is not about separating people. It's about joining us together in new and unprecedentedly free ways. It has nothing to do with removing in a vacuum the one and only support system that many of us have got. Instead, it's a demand for the conditions of possibility for our relationships to flourish and multiply. I promised I would comment a little bit on the word abolish. As you may have heard in recent years, since the George Floyd uprising, which brought the concept into popular consciousness, abolition is a word with different meanings in different continents. In France, it tends to mean prohibition, criminalization specifically of prostitution. This is not what I'm talking about. The tradition that I'm talking about runs from Hegel through to contemporary black feminist Marxists and communists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And it has this strange meaning that is nevertheless a very precise meaning that I think is the right word and not just a provocative choice. It combines destruction, actualization, and transformation. To quote Gilmore, it means changing one thing, everything. But to put it another way, an abolitionist project builds the infrastructure that will actually meet the needs that the present state of things only pretends to meet. So family abolition is the process of meeting the need for care that the family is currently tasked with and which it is fucking up. So abolition of the police, similarly, is about building the infrastructure that delivers to humanity the real safety that cops purport to deliver, when in fact they inflict racial terror. And by the same token, prison abolition means building the real justice that carceral pseudo-justice today pretends is its purpose. Bourgeois justice, the justice that serves capital, is no justice at all. To abolish justice in this sense is to give birth to a form of justice worthy of the name. So just as with prisons and the police, it is almost certainly possible, it is almost certainly impossible to abolish the family on its own. Unlike with prisons and the police, however, I think we have to be really cautious about beginning with the family. Family abolition is not, I think, a campaign slogan or a standalone platform. It's, for one thing, an attempt to describe post-capitalist life-making and the task ahead for those of us who want to communize care. The good news is that every campaign, every struggle, ecological, anti-carceral, or queer, benefits from the realization that the family is actually a thief of the flow of care in the world, and not care's supreme source. If we wager that another mode of life-making is possible, we can learn to love each other better right now, even if we don't get to abolition in our lifetimes. We can do that by starting revolutionary movements brave enough to say, yes, it's true what the far right says. Feminism wants to abolish the family. To hell with family values, and all capitalist value for that matter. And fuck parents' rights. My hunch is that just beyond the horizon, beckoning to those of us who want to hear it, there is a world of relationship no longer strangled by scarcity and no longer held hostage by economics. Thank you.
comrade. Here we are again.
Hi,
Thank
Siggy.
you for that, again, amazing talk. This is your last performance of a European tour. I think you must be exhausted after so much abolishing. Do you still enjoy it?
I do.
You do, good. So, with a very provocative title, as your book has, Abolish the Family, I'm sure, and I know, because we've been spending some time over the past weeks, and I've seen you give these talks, that you're often pushed into the defensive, right? When you present your work during the Q&As. And so in the spirit of feminist comradeship, I would like to kick off with a more generative question that also makes your plea to abolish maybe a bit more tangible for people, though it was already very tangible. So, Sophie, I would like you to tell us that what does your utopian non-family, what would it look like on a day-to-day basis? You talked about Latif, but you didn't really talk about yourself, so maybe could you give us an idea?
I think. Hello? Great. You know, it is the hardest question for me. I think the easiest way to know what I really want is to be in a situation of transformation and abundance. I am in despair right now, you know, because of the genocide. So it's a really bad time to ask me. At the same time, perhaps it is the right time, because it is times like these when we are put in touch with our core needs, desires, requirements of each other ethically, amongst other things. And the urgency of the fight is also very palpable right now. I mean, what I mean when I say that I feel it most strongly when I'm in a situation of abundance is that, you know, when you are occupying a public square, you begin to realize how incredible it feels to be reviving a form of commons and having your needs met in ways that are outside of the logic of privatized scarcity. It changes you quite fast, I think, which is why it makes sense to me that Latif is amazed at how we do kin making even just a few decades into the future, you know. Yeah, but I think I'm pretty persuaded in some ways by Charles Fourier's basic broad strokes. You know, he thinks that habitation should be on a larger scale, and that you know, people should all have to participate in some way or other in all of the tasks. You know, it's a situation where there is no economic coercion pushing you to depend non-consensually, you know, on specific people. So your kin, and this is quite scary, kind of complicated, kind of exciting prospect, are really chosen, you know. But at the same time, there is infrastructure there to ensure that those not chosen are provided for, you know. Yeah.
So the language of abolition of family abolition. It's provocative, right? And you feel when you talk to people that it hits a very sore spot, like it hurts, right? You're taking something away from people. And I feel in Belgium, on the left, we can barely get our heads around police abolition, prison abolition, let alone stand family abolition. So you already did some of the explaining at the end of the talk, what the language of abolition or what the praxis of abolition means to you, right? So, but just to reassure people in the audience, Sophie, are you going to take our grannies and mommies and babies away from us, or only our annoying drunk uncles at the Christmas party?
Neither, I'm afraid. No, we'll still have to. We'll in fact have to. We'll have to probably. I don't think it's necessarily easier. What the relationships outside of family. I think it will. We have certain containers to put our relationships in right now, and I think that sort of cuts off quite a lot of the complexity of love as it could be, but no, it's I don't know if some kind of perfect abolition is even possible in this domain. I mean, of course, people are going to live with one another and form interdependencies that are stronger than the dependent. It'll be really interesting to try and think about how to prevent certain households from accumulating things privately in terms of resources. But no, it's about meaning. It's about making your life more motherful. Motherful is a word from the Black feminist tradition. It's about recognizing everybody's need for many mothers all through life, and recognizing that the distribution of mothering labor has to be, non-gendered and communized in itself. It's about proliferation of relation.
But then you didn't consider giving the book a different title? You insist on the language of abolition, right? And proudly. Because it does the work for you.
So as I say, I think abolish has that correct theoretic force, because it means, Aufheben. What is family for right now? What do we turn to family for? It's not to destroy the family. It's to actually, in a sense, actualize its promise. I know that's not necessarily the everyday meaning, but I still kind of cleave to it a little bit. I mean, you could maybe sell a book called Positively Supersede the Family.
Very sexy. No, it's funny because yesterday during your talk in Amsterdam, you did the same, right? To give this hour and a half fierce, passionate plea to abolish the family. 200 years of archive of people, radicals who have done this from different sides and different positions, and then you end by saying, but yeah, guys, don't go out there with the sign that says abolish the family. That would be horrible. Don't do that. You did kind of the same now, and then I wonder, what do you mean? What should we do then? How do we put this beautiful plea, how do we put it to work? And I'm also telling this to myself, right? I always say, also when I'm in the class teaching and when we are radically deconstructing all the bad isms in the world, and when we are deconstructing and taking things away from people, which, like the family, we have to be super generous in what we give in return, right? Otherwise, we're just these ivory-towered scholars or museum-enclosed artists who have really nothing much to give back. So I know this is a big question, but when the family is abolished, what would you offer in return? Like, would you think of an all-encompassing welfare state that provides all the public services and transport and food and housing, and that treats all of its children like like family, or would you see it more as collective, common organizations like communal childcare or housing co-ops, or like where is your horizon on how to put family abolition into praxis?
Gosh, but there are so many questions there.
Sorry.
What?
Pick one, yeah.
Well, one of them was, this question of don't try this at home, kids. But I changed my I changed my expression of that a little bit. Plus, I didn't say don't go out there with a sign.
We cannot use it as a bumper sticker.
I'm saying don't do it. Don't try and do it alone. You can't do it without a movement against capitalism. That's really the point. Of course, yeah. I guess I'm also sort of saying, you're not actually hurting capitalism by going back to your family and saying, yeah, Mama, I heard a lecture, and I've realized that our entire life together is a form of organized scarcity. So I'd like to fight you now. I don't know. Or going up to immigrant families that are literally being tortured at the border and separated, kids in cages at the US border. I was marching just like everyone else with a conscience, stop family separation, stop, targeting families, the placards sometimes said, families belong together. Now that's something I really don't actually believe. But it doesn't mean I don't understand why that is being strategically used. I do think that what the left can do is have a conversation about whether we are gaining something by using this language, whether there are also situations where it makes just as much sense to say people belong together, stop separating people. What is the loss there? What are we actually gaining by using family values for the force of our rhetoric in a situation like that, right? I think that kind of thing is where you can put the concept to work. You can start asking people to reject the automatic sort of capitulation to the family values assumptions that dominate politics, Okay, another thing you asked me was about I guess, what I'm giving, yeah. So after the family has been abolished, I suppose I have to also, I'm sorry, kind of quibble with this framework. I think I'm trying to think of abolition as the process of building. So I don't know really about this after. I think abolition is the making present of the care that the family promises us and doesn't deliver, And so in a sense, the question doesn't quite make sense because the answer is in the question, right? It's only when we are resourced, that we are resourced. Like, what we will gain will be the process of abolition. It will be the abundance that in fact is the process that negates the family, I think. And that doesn't, like I said, if you love the people in your family, I think you actually kind of want family abolition for them. And yeah, finally, you're asking about the question of whether the state or organic grassroots communes deliver this infrastructure. I'm pretty skeptical of state-based politics. I think it's extremely risky as a route. At the same time, I think macro sort of, infrastructures are really necessary, big scale stuff. And so forms of federated sort of perhaps partially centralized, administrative organization have to exist, I want trains. So many more trains than than we have in America. We have no trains. Some trains. But yeah, But I think broadly speaking, if you're asking me, yeah, I'm more of an anti-state communist. I will confess it.
I have so many questions, and I know that we have very little time, but I am going to talk about Palestine because I think it's our moral and political imperative to do so, and I'm so happy that you do, and not like as a side note to kind of acknowledge your humanity and solidarity, but actually to really think through and with Palestine and Palestinians, and to ask the question, what does Palestine and an unfolding genocide and the targeted destruction of entire families, extended families, neighborhoods, mosques, churches, nurseries, schools, hospitals, an entire social fabric of Palestinian life. What does that tell us about the always intertwined processes of family making and family breaking, right, under empire? And Palestine is not, I mean, empire is not just Palestine out there far away, it's also Belgium. We have these ongoing histories of the Belgian Métis, for instance, thousands of mixed race children who were born under Belgian colonial rule, in Rwanda, in Congo, in Burundi, and who were born from Belgian white colonial fathers and black African mothers, and who at certain points of time were taken away from their mothers, from their communities, and placed in Belgian orphanages because they were seen as children of sin, right, in racially segregated colonies. They were put in Belgian orphanages. Later, they were taken away and put in white adoption families in Belgium. And these people today, they are kind of reclaiming their rights, right? And they are asking for recognition of what happened. And they are also asking to know where they came from and who their biological families are. And in the same way, and we already talked about it, that families are being separated at borders and by, violently separated from each other by Frontex, and the only way that many people from the global south and east manage to reach Belgium is through this process of family unification, which is like the only thing they often have left. So you already talked about it, but I kind of want to stress this. Like, if people strategically use the family, what do we do then? Like, what do these people have? What can they do with your story of family abolition? How can we be in solidarity and still doing the work of family abolition, right?
Yeah, I think that's a question of almost this dual history of family abolition struggle, not all of it under that name, some of it sort of outside the wages of the family, and some of it sort of, some of it inside, some of it outside. So you people like, the militant housewives against housework on the inside of this history, and then people like the family members of the stolen Indian children in North America, stolen by settler colonists and imprisoned really in schools where the goal was to destroy their identity and impose a kind of a new form of humanity on them. Kill the Indian, save the man was the policy in this educational process, forced re-educational process. And the abolition there is the process of almost, insisting on kinship against the imposition of family. So it's a sort of, counterintuitive, I suppose. It doesn't sound like family abolition. It sounds like, in a sense, a reunification, a sort of an insistence on decolonial kin-making. Yeah. The question of DNA, in a sense, that Latif in the future New York of the post-capitalist world, imagined by my friends, is sort of talking about critically. Yeah, it's a very painful, sticky subject right now. You can't just say, it's somehow counter-revolutionary to want to know or to use it to trace connection. Of course not. I think it's just interesting to try and find ways to make our available, relations less scarce, so that the hunger for origins, and for sort of almost like, knowledge about our patent, like our do you see what like our authorship becomes less necessary, because there are other available ways to be truly of someone, rather than simply the story of blood and gene. I don't think you can simply deny people these sorts of stories in the present. You can simply ask why they feel so important. So that this notion that children are everyone's is like a hyperstitional horizon, to be theoretical about it. It has a latent truth to it in the present, but you can only sort of try to make it more real. You can't simply insist. Yeah.
You already mentioned that the work that is needed to keep families and households going, it's super labor intensive and it's very unevenly divided according to gender lines, race lines, class lines. So there is this report by Oxfam, recent report by Oxfam, Time to Care, that states that women and girls carry out 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care work every day. When valued at minimum wage, this would represent a contribution to the global economy of at least 10.8 trillion a year, more than 3 times the size of the global tech industry. Like 10.8 trillion, I don't even know what that is, right? It's like how to even imagine that. Also, many reports, like from the OECD, state that around the world, women spend 2 to 10 times more time on unpaid care work than men, 3 to 6 hours for women versus half an hour to 2 hours for men. So I wonder, how would these gendered and racialized divisions of work be different in a more communal approach to family abolition, right? So why would, to put it very blunt, why would men or other people who are not necessarily socialized to care, why would they step into the story of family abolition? What do they have to win, right? Why would they be, what's the incentive?
Gosh, you do have good questions, Siggy. I mean, what do you think? It's funny, incentive is an interesting one.
Maybe it's the wrong word, but yeah. Like, who is the revolutionary subject of family abolition? Like, I mean, if it's gonna be if we're gonna abolish also all the genders, that means that men are also our comrades, right?
Of course.
And not just people who don't care enough. So
of course.
How can we bring everyone in caring more?
Yeah. I think my emphasis is, in this moment at least, more on the way that struggle forces people. It doesn't necessarily, I don't know. Though it's true, as you say, this gender division of labor, reproductive labor, is incredibly tenacious and persistent. It's there are so many things about the private household that have changed economically in recent decades. The 2-income household is the norm, and yet, in heterosexual couples, women are still doing 5 times more housework. It's absurd, right? The question is the right one. How do we? Who is the subject that forces this change? I think, in a sense, I'm inclined to say, like Firestone and the 1968 sort of liberationists, like women and children, they liberate themselves, they force a kind of different, they don't make that division of labor available anymore, It's not about sort of attacking men, it's about sort of removing the availability of that extractive relation to everybody else. and that's a proprietary relation amongst other things. You know, it sucks for men as well. You know, of course. Maybe that's the incentive. Like, a lot of people want to put their lives into making life rather than making profit, you know, which isn't to say, you know, we want to romanticize care work, but, you know, there are ways in which the work of sort of community, of care in a larger sense, you know, thinking ecological care, you know, arts, health, you know, building beautiful mass public baths.
That's your utopia of family abolition. A swimming pool and a bath. Yeah, cool. So maybe one last question before I hand it over to the rest of the people here. So you talk a lot about children, right? And how children are not just property of the nuclear family, but are neither helpless victims, right? So that they have, you know, that they have agency, and that they should be considered as interlocutors or comrades in the struggle of family abolition. And I'm wondering how to do that, right? And I'm even thinking in my own organizing, or when the best that we can come up with is to provide childcare that is then done by men or people who are not socialized to care, or to have a kids corner where, you know, the kids can come to so the parents can come to the demos, but then it's like the kids corner, right? So the kids are pushed in the corner. So I wonder what happens if we would put the children center stage in the story of family abolition. How would we do that? How would we tell this story to kids, and how would we enable them to speak to us?
Yeah, this is the question that Lane McKinley, calls, you know, family abolition for kids and family abolition with kids. How would you talk to your kid about family abolition is one of the questions she asks as a mother in an essay that she's written on this. And I think her answer is about you know, being genuinely curious about the leadership and self-determination of young people. So assuming that it makes sense for a young person to have consulted with other young people first, you know, what do you think is the best thing for you and the people you love, you know? Simply just this is the same question in a certain sense as it is for anybody else, you know? Kids understand how certain kinds of demands on people in their lives are irrational. You know, kids aren't stupid. They can see when their mother, or maybe not mother, you know, could be a male mother. Motherer is the word I've come up with for that, right? Like, is unfulfilled. I could perceive that about my mother when I was young. I thought, oh, I don't think this is a great deal for her. I don't, you know? Like, which isn't, I mean, I think people imagine children to be purely just kind of, I don't know, accumulators, you know, almost like little mini capitalists who wants to extract as much as possible. So, you know, like as much of my individual parents' time as I possibly can get. It's not really that simple, is it? Yeah, I mean, there's a rich history of children's liberationism that we could be reading and reading grouping about, you know, because there's plenty of actual experience and experimentation in, especially that 60s red decade where Black Panthers, you know, anti-psychiatry, you know, feminists, gay liberationists were making childcare centers, some of them on a sort of radical anti-authoritarian model where children were sort of participating in the design and the running of the infrastructure. You know, there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge there that has been erased, along with family abolition from the collective memory of what feminism is, because in the 80s, when the neoliberal counter-revolution crushed the left, a lot of feminists started to say, oh, yeah, no, feminism never tried to abolish the family. That's crazy. And that was a really sad, maybe understandable, but sort of sad denial of the archive that I'm, as I say, trying to bring back to the surface, In any case, are you going to read that poem, Ziggy?
No problem, I'm going to start crying again, so I'm going to give it to the... It was a beautiful poem by Khalil Gibran. If there's more time, I will we'll end by it, but maybe we can first open it up to the rest of the audience, if people have questions. There's a hand. A brave hand.
Thank you. So this was a very thought-provoking lecture explanation about transitioning beyond the family as we know it. So I've been thinking about alternatives which already existed, thinking about, what's the word, priories? What? Abbey? Yes, Abbey. The Abbey as a collective of people working together and without any family or blood-related values. Monastery works as well. What I see in common in all those alternatives is that there's often an excess of labor and human resources, as you've explained, and that there's some sort of ideals, different ideals to what we have today that are driving them. And I was wondering if you have any idea what those motivators could be for what we could do upon transitioning beyond our current core families.
Do you want to take some questions? And then maybe we can collect some questions and then...
Okay, thank you for your interesting lecture. I think young people are already pushed in abolishing the family because it's way too expensive these days if you want to live in a city to form like a family. There's a lot of people who do co-housing, and so I see that it's quite difficult to live like together with people you don't know really, and how to stay together. Like with a family, yeah, everyone knows that it's very difficult sometimes, but you accept it because it's family. But when you live together with people you don't know for economical reasons, and then, yeah, it doesn't work, you go to another, you search for other people. So, yeah, I wonder if you could comment on that, like what can keep us together? You say like love, but it's not so easy. That's also in families, but it's not easy, yeah.
Oh, I do not say that love is the driver, the potentiator. No. I did not say that. I say that material conditions being communized gives us the prospect of developing a form of love that is more free. It's not that way around. it's not, no. But I appreciate the question very much. Sorry, I started answering. We were going to collect more questions. I'll quickly answer these two. Yeah, of course, absolutely. This question of, well, I would insist it's not really abolishing the family. Capitalism's pressures on the family are often sort of called that in the retort, you know, to this politics. Like, that is a common way of phrasing it, you know, like, oh, but capitalism is already abolishing the family because no one can afford to have one. Well, no, that's actually not, that's rather the opposite of it's making it an even more impossible demand, you know, which is kind of, in fact, intensifying the family in a sense. And when people can't even afford to move out of their parents' house, which, I mean, 75% of the young people in certain European countries can't afford to move out of their parents' house or whatever, live with, you know, that is not, you know, family abolition. And the economic coercion that drives cohabitation with non-family members is also an extension of the logic of scarcity, in a sense, that is the problem, you know. Yeah, I guess that's my comment about that. Like, yeah, the sort of pseudo-communal survival mechanisms of the present have a lot to teach us in some cases, but are deeply compromised and often reactive. And yeah, you know, everybody knows how difficult it is to live with, you know, other people, whether they're family or not, right? Like, yeah, the insistence of abolitionism in the precinct of the private household is the sort of lessening of burdens, right, from private households. So you don't have to turn to the private household to get certain needs met. So it's about seeing what becomes possible when you know that key needs of your, you know, your body and are guaranteed in the common realm, you know. So yeah, food, shelter, etc., etc. Just list as many as you want, and that's the utopian sort of spiral, realizing what your needs are, you know, and turning things that are considered luxuries into basic needs. That's what, anyway. But yeah, I liked this comment about these communities that do exist and what the motivators are, as it is a useful question. Yeah, you know, there is this kind of debate about that. I guess Siggy was also curious a little bit. There are kind of perspectives in the revolutionary conversation, you know, amongst family abolitionists about how certain options need to be made unavailable to people, you know. So you can't choose in the sort of post-capitalist sort of society to enter into exclusive sort of contracts like marriage. That's one argument, you know. So one of the, I suppose, motivators might be you know, a kind of collective insistence that certain forms of sort of retreat are not okay if you want to be part of the wider community. So of course some privacy is obviously a beautiful sort of, you know, important part of life, right? Like Emmy O'Brien talks about the need for spaces of intimacy that are you know, personal. But we might want to think about maybe even yeah, that edge of coercion that also has to be part of the revolutionary process, even as you destroy economic coercion. Yeah, maybe there are certain things we have to take away, such as the wages of marriage, maybe. Siggy's also very smart and expert, so maybe you can ask her questions too.
We'll do a last round of questions. I don't. I'm looking at looking for Anaïs. Anaïs, do we have time? Okay, let's go.
Hi. Yeah.
From where?
If you're searching.
Yes.
You talked about. Whoa, this is very loud. This microphone. Maybe it's only for me. So you talked about the impossibility of marriage as an incentive. And I was wondering, as like marriage as well as nuclear families for queers have been, just incompatible for a very long time. I was wondering how queerness enters in your story about abolishing the family.
Great question. I can't. Can you wave at me? The voice. Oh, there. Thank you.
There were more hands, I think. There's a hand here, and a hand there, and a hand there.
Hello. I have like one question stemming from me and one question stemming from my friend here next there. Okay. And the first question is like not really related to the lecture, but like stemming from my own like nerd interests in your work as is a curiosity towards like the forthcoming work on enemy feminisms that I'm like really looking forward to. And I saw a very short description on a Substack post that
It's Patreon, actually. Everybody.
no, I think if I'm not mistaken, it was the Patreon a Substack post by your partner.
Oh, okay, fine. It was.
Yeah, sorry.
Vicky's Substack.
Yeah, a great post, but like, but my question towards like the forthcoming work was, if all the enemy feminisms you like researched and described, what were like the most difficult nuts to crack, or like were like stunningly under theorized, or like, because like it's the storied history and a very interesting history, but like I'm like interested in the hard nuts of it all. And then the second question is within like the whole tapestry of like family abolition and like prefigurative like living, how something like a concept and a word and a practice like polyamory could figure in all of it.
Yes, okay. Hard question to add, another one too. But my question is about where to start from when you want to abolish the family. Is there an ethical framework you can use? I hear you talk about collectivism and anti-statism, and maybe the word ethical is not really right. I don't really know what to use, but I'm looking for something like, I don't know, something to oppose romanticism, but maybe like humanism, but these are all the classical things. Maybe there's a framework I'm missing.
There was one more hand here, I think.
Good luck remembering all the questions. I'll add mine. So regarding your concerns for strategy and abolishment as reaching for the future but starting from the present, which I found very important and interesting. Maybe I misunderstood your remark, but at one point you spoke about living in a period of demobilization, and all around us there is, I think, swaths of mass mobilization happening in your country in the past years. There's been more people in the streets in sheer numbers in France and the UK, for example, than during 68, 69. So my question is, how do you think, well, are there any specific examples or historical or contemporary or possibilities you see of infusing family abolitionist line into mass mobilization, more typical union work or striking or what's happening right now?
Those are all great questions. No, you're right. Sorry, it's not a universal picture of demobilization at all. Right now, everyone is sorry, I don't. Why did I say that? Do you have a theory why I said we were in a period of demobilization?
I have no theories.
Okay, I might need to think about why I said we were in a period of demobilization when we're obviously not. Maybe I'm the one who's demobilized. Thanks for catching that and calling me out on it. I think, I mean, it remains the case that, when it comes to, maybe I'm saying this because, we've lost so much ground around, gender and trans children related stuff in the States where I live, and Roe versus Wade was struck down and there was not that much mobilization in response to that. Anyway, I think it is useful, to use, it's not just useful, it's imperative, right? But it's useful to think about the connections between trans children and their autonomy and the right-wing sort of reproductive sort of counter-revolution or assault on reproductive rights is also connected with, the attempt to discipline all children, to discipline procreation and demographic futurity generally, to re-privatize care, to make the links basically, between gestational autonomy, gender, self-determination, and general bodily autonomy, to use this as an opportunity to not, do single issue politics, but to be in comradely relation across generations, that word comradely might be my response to the question about the ethic that could counter romanticism and familism. I think comradeliness and solidarity would be my answer. In brief, if that's not too sort of pat, but it, shit. The queer family. The role of queerness. I mean, I am a little bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to, queer kinship, I think. Sure, all kinship is made, not given. If that makes sense. Like, the thing to understand about kinship is that it's always actually made, not given. So I get the beauty. I insist. I talk about the value and the skills that can be found in queer sort of survival histories, and I talk about mothering against motherhood. The ensemble of labors which can, when done collectively, be pitted against the patriarchal institution of motherhood, and that comes from a black feminist tradition that talks about other mothers in this sense as structurally queer. And I am interested in queerness in the sense that I'm a goddamn, communist of some description, a narco-communist who wants to, destroy private property, and queerness was evolved conceptually as an insurgency against private property in a sense. But given that that's not anymore the valence of the word, I feel like a nostalgic or a sort of, I don't think that has that force. To queer something has become something much easier that you can do supposedly from a very kind of consumerist or bourgeois sort of, standpoint. And so Kathy Weeks is a little bit similar when it comes to non-monogamy or polyamory. When she talks about solutions in the framework of abolishing the family, she's quite dismissive of, polyamory, on its own. I think I'm actually maybe a bit more insistent that there is something to defend about non-monogamy or anti-monogamy. Maybe that's the more interesting phrase. Because I think there's a reproductive sort of backsliding or sort of revanchism going on the left, where it's very fashionable in the US left now to be very sort of dismissive of polyamory, as though, all poly people are kind of upper middle class, white people profiled in the New Yorker, like straight people in particular, like what the I just really find this very reactionary. There's a red-brown sort of dangerous kind of, there's a sort of anti-feminist undertow coming through on the left, where it's where suddenly queer practices are being dismissed as somehow bourgeois, and this is really dangerous. So it makes me kind of want to return a little bit to the value of of queer life against capitalism. Yeah, so I suppose I've just said something very equivocal, like, I don't know. I mean, I'm against, obviously the subsumption of sort of, gay liberation into, the equal marriage ditch. I mean, that maybe goes without saying, in the 70s, people were quite, clear-sighted that this was an available pathway. There was a big fight within feminism and gay liberation, just as there was, in a sense, amongst, black radicals too, in a similar way. Like, how do we orient towards the family? Is there freedom for us in that form? And some gays were like, yes, just as some black feminists were like, of course, we're going to we're gonna prove that even under slavery, black people had the family, and they did patriarchy as best they could, even when it was made impossible for them, and that's why we're going to be respectable members of society. And other feminists were saying there's never going to be freedom for black people within the family form. It is constitutively anti-black. That fight, in a sense, is really similar in both of these milieus, But I think people forget that, and they don't know that, and they, I think we can have that fight again. Let's have that fight again. About enemy feminisms, I am excited to show you all my next book, which is very long and historical, and tells a story about police feminism, clan feminism, pro-life, anti-abortion feminism, turfism, and many other assorted monsters. And maybe I'll be able to come back and have a further conversation with you at that point when that comes out. I think you've been the most wonderful final audience of my European tour, and I'm glad to have been in conversation with you, Siggy. Yeah. What a joy.
Always. Thank you so much, Sophie, and thanks everyone for engaging with us and for being here.